Hey guys, in this podcast we talk about different health topics. As we are not experts, we would ask for you to talk to your physician or doctor first before trying anything that we suggest here in this podcast. In this podcast, we also discuss third-party opinions. Please know that we have no intention of misrepresenting them, and we apologize in advance if we do so. Thanks. Hey everyone, welcome back to another Contemplation Hypothezation. I'm Nick.
And I'm Paul.
And today the topic is
Self-development.
Alright, let's jump into it. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Okay, guys. So actually, today we're going to talk about kind of a theory I've put together. One thing I've wanted to do is break down psychology into logical sequences so that we can use it, so that I can use it for self-development. So first off, this is my general opinion of self-development. There's a big debate in the field of whether self-development should be about changing yourself or improving yourself.
Okay.
And I don't think that self-development should be about changing yourself. I think that we have natural characteristics that are both genetic and inherent to our nature, and I think that we need to stay true to those. Otherwise, we turn into like a machine, a robot who does things just for manipulation of other people.
Okay.
So I don't think change is the answer, and I don't think that should be the objective of self-development. Instead, I think the objective of self-development should be about bringing about the best characteristics of ourselves at the times that we want. So like you're going on a date with someone, you want to be able to bring out the best qualities of yourself. Every person has good qualities to themselves that they bring out on occasion. The people who are most effective with other people are people who can bring out those good qualities more frequently, more often. So that should be our objective.
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to ask about that day analogy, I mean, and I know this has been shown, but a lot of people change their personalities depending on the people that they're interacting with. Mm-hmm. You act differently with your teacher than you do with your best friend. So my question is when you say change versus improving, I think a lot of us try to change our personality to match we think what other people will like.
I'm actually really glad you brought this up because this is a point that I wanted to emphasize because it's really important. But one area of psychology which I think is underdeveloped and there's very little spoken about, but it's very self-evident to me in my study of psychology is that almost all of us have, all of us have multiple personalities.
Oh man, I gotta go check.
Now, obviously, the clinical multi-personality disorder is it's debatable to whether it even exists, but at the same time, it's a problem. Like when I say that we all have multiple personalities, don't associate it with multiple personality disorders. What I mean by that is that when we're talking with our grandma, when we're talking with like a parent, versus when we're talking to our friends, we show different sides of ourselves. The amount of material that we censor is very different around our best friend than around a parent. And so when I say that we want to bring out the best qualities, what I'm saying is that all of us have a personality that's very magnetic towards people, that is very sociable, very friendly, awesome, that people like.
Yeah, built a sustained relationship with the other person.
And so our goal is to bring out that personality more frequently. And that's a very hard thing to do because we fight internal battles to do that. And different things get in the way of that. And today we're actually going to go over my theories on that multiple personality and how it exists.
All right, let's hear them. Let's do this.
So actually, besides self-development, another core topic that I really want to go over today are thoughts. Now, thoughts is a very ambiguous field. Thoughts are very inexplicable to most people, and it's so big that I don't know if I can fit everything I want to say into this podcast. But anyway, I just have a question for viewers. What do you think about most of the time? Let me ask you. Do you know what you've been thinking about for the last 3 hours?
Probably what I'm going to do next.
Yeah.
The very next.
So you have some idea, but you would have a really hard time reaccounting every single thing that you have thought about, right?
Yeah.
And the reason why that is because we think in thought patterns. We have habitual thoughts that happen most of the day. In psychology, they say that 95% of our daily activities, our habits, are done subconsciously. So the reason why we're unable to think about what we've been thinking about most of the time is because it's so habitual and it's done subconsciously. So the question I pose is, how is something that's so crucial, and we'll get to why it's so crucial, so little understood by the average person? And that is the question I pose.
And when you're saying, when you say it being literally or like not understood very well,
was our thought process.
Our thought process and why we can't recall our own thought process that we just.
Why we know it's more like why do we know so little about something so instrumental to our life? Now I want to talk about why I believe thoughts are the most important thing, and then that will further explain why I think it's so ridiculous that so few people know so little about their own thought processes.
Gotcha. Okay.
So thoughts affect. First off, they affect your success in life, they affect your happiness, they affect your relationships, they affect how much you enjoy an activity, they affect pretty much everything, because without our thoughts, it's hard to really, know like whether we enjoy something or not. Like when you're doing something fun with your friends, there's a thought in your head that says, this is fun. And then that's what causes a chemical reaction of dopamine. So that gets into also like conditioned responses. Oftentimes, like when certain words are said, it releases chemicals in the brain. So basically what I'm saying is that your thoughts are the most instrumental thing, yet we know so little about them. Like before I said 95% of our day is filled up with habits, and we have these habitual thought patterns. So what I say is the core to self-development is understanding these thought patterns, why they exist the way they do. And by dissecting these thought patterns, we can understand ourselves better than we do, far better. And then we can make the changes necessary to become more of the person that we want to become, that personality, and bring it out more. So I want to get into that. So the question that I first posed was, why do we know so little about our thoughts? And so let me jump into sort of my theory onto how these thought patterns form and why they form. And obviously, when we dissect thoughts, it's going to be very different for each person, but we're going to see core truths.
Okay.
So in psychology, there's an area that was at one point super developed, and then it's kind of gone overlooked. It's been overlooked, and it's called operant conditioning.
Okay.
Pavlov did an experiment where he rang a bell, and a dog, followed the command, and then when he gave a dog a treat, and then when he rang the bell, the dog expected a treat.
Right.
So my theory to why we develop these thought patterns is operant conditioning. But there's another element to it, and it's the pain and pleasure principle. This is a common theme of self-development. Like Anthony Robbins will talk about the pain and pleasure thing. And although I think it has some value in that sense, I think that where we can really see it play is in the development of these thought patterns. And so my theory is that pain and pleasure is what creates these thought habits, these habits that we have. But to first understand that, we first need to understand another concept of psychology, and that is coping mechanisms.
Okay.
In my previous podcast, I talked about defense mechanisms, and what defense mechanisms are is our body's ways to prevent us from losing our self-image.
Okay.
They prevent our self-image from being destroyed.
So, like, you defend yourself and you say, well, I might not be that good of a swimmer, but at least I get all A's on my report
Yeah,
card.
exactly. It's denial,
Right.
denying the truth, or, rationalizing. Like what you described is just rationalizing. You say, well, I'm not good at this, but I am good at this.
So therefore, I'm so
You're
good
avoiding that discomfort that comes from
not being a good swimmer.
Yeah, and so there you can see the element of pain and pleasure in the defense mechanisms. I'm glad you brought that up, actually.
Yeah.
So another reason why we rationalize and we have denial and things like that is to avoid pain and pleasure, to avoid pain and seek pleasure.
Right.
It's important to also recognize that our bodies fear pain much more than we seek pleasure.
Right, that makes sense. And actually, that's if you look at the 4 motivations for getting a job or how the economy works, fear works much more than curiosity. Curiosity is the weakest. Like, I wonder if this will be able to design a new method to, do back surgery or something.
Yeah.
And that's curiosity.
Yes, curiosity.
Which people are like, that's good. You're going to work because you're curious and you like that stuff.
Yeah.
But that has shown to be the weakest instigator of actually motivating people to get to work.
Yeah.
Rather, fear of losing your job, not being able to provide food for your family. All those things are a much, much stronger motivator.
Right, exactly. And so in defense mechanisms, we see that.
Yeah.
We see that our body avoids pain and we see pleasure. And this another example of that, which I think is really common, is like when we get criticism, when we get feedback. It's like we could get 100 people saying how great of a job we did, but the one that we remember is that one person who criticizes us.
Yeah, I agree with you. Especially with guys, compliments definitely boost just your ability to relate with them. Mm-hmm. But an insult is like 100 compliments worth.
Right. Yeah.
Negativity. So. I believe that actually sticks more with guys than girls. I think, especially for relationships, girls tend to value more quality time, where guys tend to value more words of affirmation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's actually from the 5 love languages.
Now that's interesting because actually, I want to talk today about validation and its role in the psyche and our thought process. That's a part of my theory, and so that's defense mechanisms for you. So now coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms, I think, are more instrumental on a daily basis than defense mechanisms. Like we don't encounter that much feedback or criticism, and I discussed that before because people don't want to hurt our feelings. They don't want to cause distress within the relationship. But coping mechanisms are almost always affecting us. Almost all the time we're affected by coping mechanisms. And the reason why is because stress is almost always impacting us. You walk in a room with 2 people, your stress increases. You walk in a room with 100 people, it increases much more. And what happens in the body is that cortisone is released. And cortisone is constantly being released into our system based on the situations. So what a coping mechanism is our abilities to deal with that stress and get it under control. And like I said before, the pain-pleasure thing is coming into play. The coping mechanism comes in play to maintain a healthy state of mind and to not get too upset.
And not to get too stressed out. I was just going to say, remember, your body releases cortisone to adapt to your ability to kind of enhance your ability given the stress that you're under so that you perform better. But if you were able to calm yourself and you're in front of 100 people, it doesn't really matter if you're in front of 2 or 100 if you have a strong ability to calm yourself, because your body physiologically will not release all this cortisone as if you're under this huge stressful situation.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing you see is even when someone walks in a room with no people, let's say the room's cluttered, cortisol is released into the bloodstream and you start feeling stressed. So pretty much everything we do, we encounter these coping mechanisms and how we deal with that. So one of the things, now recognize that my theory comes a lot from personal observation and observation of those around me, but it's somewhat biased because those around me are often probably pretty similar to me, and that's why I'm friends with them in the first place. So there's a whole group of people that I don't see, so I could be wrong in some elements. But my theory is that when we're in a stressful situation, depending on the amount of stress, we tend to go back into the most comfortable area of our mind.
Okay.
So it's important to recognize that we have like very emotional centered areas of our brains. We have very logical centers of our brain.
Right.
And I think the difference between like an introvert and an extrovert is like how they cope under stress. And so for me personally, one thing I struggled with is that when I feel more stress, I tend to get more logical. And so it brought me to thinking, like, why is this? I started analyzing the situation, and I become very bad socially. I screw up. I don't know what to say. I'm not funny anymore, and things like that. And so I was like, why does this happen? I'll also get into why I think it's really important to understand ourselves and how this applies to yourself. But
right.
So what I thought about was like, why do my thoughts do this? Why does this happen? And my theory is that the logical part of my brain is the area that I'm most comfortable with. If you're familiar with the Myers-Briggs test, which I recommend everyone takes, Myers-Briggs test basically breaks your personality into like 5 different characteristics. Mine's INTP, introvert, intuitive, thinking, perceptive. And each one of those is like your more dominant area. And so because I'm thinking, that the thinking area of my brain is more dominant. So what happens when I'm in a stressful situation is that I resort back to the area I'm most comfortable. And that follows that pain and pleasure principle, is that when we're stressed, our brain starts doing stuff to take that stress away. So my coping mechanism is to go back to that brain state that's most comfortable with. But that poses a problem because when you're in a social situation, you don't want to be thinking like you would like when you're writing a paper.
Okay, so quick analogy. So like if you're playing tennis and you're used to doing right-handed forehands, and you're playing against someone who's actually pretty good, then you kind of are like, okay, cool, I can handle with my right hand. But let's say they say you're only allowed to play left-handed. You're not as comfortable, and you don't do it as well, and so you have more stress that you might not perform as well. So you're saying your logical side is more of like your right hand. This is what you've been trained in your entire time.
We could compare. It's analogous to like your right hand.
Yeah.
You come back to that under stress. This is a great analogy.
But if the ball is hit too far to the left, even though you're more comfortable with your right, you really need to hit it with your left hand.
Right.
Which is like a social situation, in that you don't want to use your logic side. You want to use your emotional side instead.
Exactly. Yeah. So that kind of concludes what I wanted to say about coping mechanisms. But the general theme here is that our thoughts are very linked to our brain staying in a healthy state and avoiding pain. And sometimes it's seeking out pleasure. So my theory is that those are the 2 core motivations that control what causes these habitual thought patterns. Now, another thing I want to take from this is that our self-identity should not be our thoughts. There's a famous quote by someone who says, "I am, therefore,"
or "I think, therefore I am."
I think, therefore
Descartes.
I am. Descartes, yeah. And what Descartes is getting at is this really interesting question of whether we are our thoughts. Because what are we if we're not our thoughts? Who are we if I don't, in my brain, if I don't think about, I'm, good at this, good at this, good at that, if I don't have those thoughts, then what am I?
Yeah.
And so the internal world plays a big part in our self-identity. But what I think is important to recognize is that our thoughts are not who we are. There's something behind our thoughts.
Okay.
And that is what allows for conscious self-awareness. There's a good word that philosophers use. It's called intentionality. And intentionality is a term used to describe the characteristics that make us human and separate us from other species of animals. Intentionality is sort of a self-awareness that exists. Now, what you can do is you can sit in a room and just sit there and observe your thoughts. And so you have to ask yourself, how is this happening? Like, how do I observe my thoughts?
Right.
You actually run into a tautology, which is circular thinking, where it's like, my thoughts are observing my thoughts, but then it's just my thought that I'm observing my thought, and it never ends. But it's this characteristic that separates us from other animals. So the thing that I want to get to is if we don't associate ourselves with our thoughts, we can actually work to change these thoughts. Because what most people do is that they assume their thoughts are them. And I think it's pretty self-evident that your thoughts aren't you in a lot of situations, because your thoughts go against what you actually want as a person. So consider that you're in a basketball game and you're shooting a free throw to win the championship.
Okay.
Now, your thoughts in your head, if you pay attention to them, they are imagining you missing that shot.
Right.
They're telling you can't make this. You're not good enough. Things like that. And that goes very much against what you want. You want to win. You want very badly to win, but your thoughts don't want you to win. And so what is evident here is a distinction between your thoughts and who you are as a person. And so when we make that distinction, we can then start to analyze our thoughts and understand how these thoughts make up who we are as a person. And then we can use these to improve different areas of our lives. And that's where we get into self-development.
Okay, yeah, let me just do a science, little science cutout right here. So about their conscious and subconscious, I just want to get into that. Sometimes what we think is, oh, well, my conscious part is obviously who I am, but obviously that's not it. You have your subconscious as well. And just like an iceberg, your conscious is just the tip. And that self-recognition, that intentionality that you're talking about, that recognition that you are conscious is built up from your subconscious. You have to have 90% subconscious in order to get 10% conscious. So the whole point is that you can't actually be conscious of your whole brain because you don't have enough subconscious to be conscious of your subconsciousness. So in other words, the point is that you can never actually be conscious of your entire brain, all your thoughts, because you need more subconscious than what can be conscious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this gets into tautologies like crazy. So let's go over some examples sort of how our thoughts affect social interactions, because it's crucial. Like what we're thinking in our head very much change the course of an interaction. So when you're in a social situation, there's two things you're thinking about. First, you're thinking about what does this person think about me? Then you're thinking about what does this person think that I'm thinking about me? and actually three things, because you're thinking like, what do I think of this other person?
Right.
And you're not very consciously aware of all these things, but if you actually go in a social situation, you'll start observing that this is actually taking place.
Right.
And so these thoughts that you have about like what this person's thinking about you and what this person thinks that you're thinking about you is like alters the course of the conversation. Like if you think this person doesn't like you, it's going to alter your behaviors, your body posture, how your tonality, and it's going to lead you with a bad impression. So I think that people who are exceptional with people, and one of the reasons why I keep going back to this idea that people should be exceptional with people is that I believe deep down, and my objective is to become good with people, because my observations of people who are good with people is that they like have the most, they get validated the most, they feel good about themselves, and they're able to help others more, and they just live better lives in general. And that's really pushing, but that to me is what's important. To someone else, something else might be important, and that's where you really have to figure out for yourself what your objective is in the end. So for me, when I analyze stuff, I'm looking for like, what is it that makes someone good with this other person? So the thoughts that are going on about what you think about this, what you think this person thinks about you, and that is going to alter the course of the thing. And so that's just a little example of how our thoughts affect external reality.
Yeah. So maybe let's just get a concrete example to illustrate your point. So let's say Paul is on a date with a girl, and so maybe she saw that he in class like always knew all the answers and stuff. So Paul thinks that she thinks that Paul is smart, right? And maybe in reality though, like Paul gave some body language signs to her that just showed her that he's not actually that smart. Like he's always like putting his head down, crossed arms or something.
That means I'm not smart.
Yeah, I don't know. Just roll with this.
I'll roll with this. Yeah.
So the whole point. What is the point you're trying to say from this?
The point is that we need to start observing our thoughts, because our thoughts play an elementary role in everything that we do. When I'm in that social interaction with that girl, if I think that she thinks of me like that, then it affects my course of action during the conversation. If I think she's dumb, then what's likely going to happen as a defense mechanism is me trying to seek validation to show that I'm smart. So if a girl thinks I'm dumb, I may start talking about, like smart stuff if I perceive that. But let's say she doesn't think I'm smart and I just start talking about that. It's discourse and unnecessary and not important to the interaction whatsoever.
So what you're saying is the most important factor is to clarify, is to act on facts that you know, not what you perceive.
Well, I don't think there's much you can actually know. But what I think is important is to think positively. Because when you think negatively in a social situation, what results is unhealthy behavior towards that person, unnecessary validation seeking. Like I said, like if she thinks I'm smart, like I'm not smart, then I'm going to seek this attention from her. That's going to cause bad. Like people don't like constantly being like forced to validate other people. I'll get into that because validation is a huge area of this.
But one thing I want, as a devil's advocate, I mean, I feel like this is useful because you could be on the wary side. So for example, let's say someone perceives you as like this boasting, prideful guy.
Right.
So thinking that they think that of you, you don't do anything that would be boastful or prideful to just kind of balance out what they actually think of you.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Like you don't want to assume that negative stuff is bad. First off, negative thinking is very good for us. When we think pessimistically, we become more prepared. If you think if you're worried that people are going to make fun of you before a stand-up, well, that'd be good if they made fun of you. But if you're doing stand-up comedy routine and you're worried that people aren't going to laugh, then you're going to sit down and prepare a lot more.
Right.
But what we have to look at, and this is where the element of self-analysis comes in, is when this is hurting us. This is when each individual situation is. It's really important in psychology to look at specific examples, and this is where everyone needs to be their own therapist. If I'm on a date and I think the girl thinks I'm dumb, that me seeking validation for being an intelligent person is not helping to build a good connection or relationship with people. Now, I don't want to keep saying that one because validation, I will get into that and explain that more and what I mean by that. But you need to look at specifics because, yes, sometimes it's better to perceive someone having a negative opinion of you because you prepare more and you do stuff like that. But oftentimes, it's hurting us. When you believe that another person thinks you're like a loser, then you start taking on the qualities of a loser. There's nothing good that's coming from that. And if you don't, and often when people are perceived that they are a loser, the first thing that they do is try to prove by seeking validation for them being cool. And honestly, that is the first sign that the person is a loser, when they're trying to prove to you that there's something, because it doesn't come off of them naturally.
Right. Okay.
So that's what's important. And specifics are very important in everything. You have to look at specifics, and I don't want like people to take what I say and apply it to everything.
Right.
Because they need to look at the specifics. So kind of getting into this, I want to talk maybe a little bit about my own self-analysis. So I like to just sit and kind of observe my thinking, and then ask myself, why do I think this, and dissect the reasons behind it. And so the other day I was just sitting and I realized, man, I think a lot about self-development stuff. And so I asked myself, why do I think a lot about self-development? And I think everybody can do the same sort of thing with their own thoughts. They can think, like, why is it that 90% of the time this is what I think about? And when I thought about it, I was trying to pinpoint exactly, and I may be wrong, but I think that I think about self-development as sort of the pain-pleasure thing. I'm trying to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. Now, why does thinking about self-development do that? Because sometimes, like, if I'm not accepting the way things actually are, the real realities of things, and I think about how things should be, or how I could become something better. And so when things aren't the way I want them to be, I think about how I can change to be something better. And when I think about how I can change to be something better, it makes me feel comfortable. It makes me feel good about myself. I say, like, you see the ego doing this a lot. You say, like, I'm not good at this, but I'm better than Bob at this. I'm better at this. That's a defense mechanism or coping mechanism in order to make you, to take off that stress and put you into a better state of mind. So what I've started to realize is that when we dissect our thoughts, we can start to see who we are and like what problems we're trying to cope with. And everybody has to do it with specifics.
Right. Depending on what exactly you think about most of the time.
Right, yeah. And depending on what your habitual thoughts are.
But you're saying most likely the reason what you fall back on is probably the thing that gives you the most amount of pleasure and eliminates pain from the environment.
And so what I realized from this is that what I need to do is, I have a problem with accepting reality. That's what I came up with. Now, I could be wrong, but a lot of times, like when I fall back into that logical part of my brain in a social situation, it's because I'm discomforted from the stress. And then I start thinking about self-development because I think, I will one day, be not like this.
Yeah.
And so
that gives you pleasure right then.
It gives me pleasure right then. So I feel good, even
if it never happens, you still have pleasure.
And that's very important that you bring that up, because that shows that even though these things can hurt us, they also help us. And that's why they're there in the first place.
Right.
They're just not ideal. We can do better.
Right. So if you're like in a situation and you think, you're like, oh man, I just hate my job. But one day after I finish school, get through school, I'm going to be like this amazing like CEO.
Yeah.
And I'm going to just like love my job. And things are going to be great then. And when you're thinking that in that moment, you're actually happy, even though you're in a bad job situation. Uh-huh. And that CEO thing can never actually happen, but it doesn't matter.
It still helped you then.
It still helped you, yeah.
But the question is, like, I think that's a great example, because we have to really examine whether these thoughts are bad or good, because they're making you feel better. They're avoiding that stress. So what's bad about them? And so maybe what's bad about them is that you're never going to become that CEO, because all you do is think about it, and you don't really accept who you actually are. And like I talked about last time, how before we can change, we must accept the reality of a situation. So instead of going off and thinking about all these future things, if we actually want those to come into existence, we must learn to accept the reality. And that's why I think right now in pop psychology, being in the moment is really popular. Like the preaching about being in the moment. Because when we're in the moment, we accept things the way they are, and we just experience life as it is. And to me, I think that's very important. When you're in a social situation, you're in the moment. Your jokes are funny, like people like you and things like that.
Yeah, right.
I mentioned earlier about how I talk about validation and the pivotal role that validation plays in our relationships and stuff, and how it's linked to the pain and pleasure thing. So Nick has talked to me about it before, but we both really like the author Stephen Covey.
Yeah. Right.
And one thing that Stephen Covey says both really stick out to both of us. And that was seek first to understand before being understood.
Right.
Now, I want to dissect why this principle is so true. The idea behind it is that, like, let's say you have an eye doctor and stuff, and you go to him, and he gives you his he notices that you have an eye problem, and he gives you his glasses. And he's like, these have worked for me for 15 years.
Yeah.
Why don't you take them and try them? Well, of course they're not going to work for you. This is what people do, though. They just give you advice without truly understanding the problem.
And that was exactly Steve Covey's example in the book.
Right, yeah.
Right.
And so the problem that we have is that we often, give advice before we truly understand another person. And so I want to talk about how, why being understood is so instrumental to being a person and why it's so important. One thing I've noticed from pretty much any social interaction I've ever had is that everybody, and I mean everybody, appreciates being having their jokes laughed at, appreciates
Yes.
people giving them a compliment.
Right.
Everybody, no matter how mean they are, whatever, when you smile and laugh at something they said, they feel good. They feel validated.
Right. A smile is a compliment.
A smile is a compliment. So that's how you can have, like introverts who don't necessarily tell funny stories and do different stuff can be very well liked because, they smile and they laugh and they validate non-verbally.
Right.
And actually, that's another whole topic, but nonverbal communication is 90% of communication.
Right. Body language and all
Body
that.
language.
But anyways,
like
getting on to what you were saying.
about validation and stuff. So as people, we seek validation partly because, we are lonely as people. We kind of live in this internal world in our heads with just our thoughts and stuff. Now, the reason why we tend to like people who are similar to us is just like validation. We assume that because they're similar to us, that they like the same stuff we do, and so it validates what we like.
Right.
So that poses a question: why do we need people to validate us? So Nick, why don't you take this one?
Yeah. So basically, a lot of people think that this stems from evolution. Mm-hmm. So if you look at different animals in different ecosystems, everybody has a different strategy of survival. For example, an alligator or like a spider, for example, can wait and then catch its prey alone. Notice how it can do that alone. It makes its own web and it catches its own prey alone.
Right. Yes.
But notice how birds, for example, need to feed their young.
Yeah.
They are dependent on each other. There's a lot of other organisms that are dependent. There are even different species that are dependent on each other. Actually, the bacteria on us are dependent on us, and we're dependent on them. And that's called a symbiotic relationship. The opposite of that is a parasitic relationship. So, so basically, that is what people think why we need to be validated. Because if you win points with this person, if they like you a lot, then they feel,
Social
this
value.
person can help me. And if I have someone who can help me and I help them, then we'll be able as a team to be able to accomplish more than I could alone.
Exactly.
If there's a hunter and a gatherer, you can do much more. You need both of them in order to make the system work.
And then on top of that, you have tribes of people. People moved around in tribes, and so if you're ostracized from the group, it has devastating consequences. You die, just like you're saying.
Exactly.
People need to be in groups, and they need each other.
Try being the man of survival on your own. It's impossible. You just can't. And the problem is that we need a lot of people together in unison. I mean, the way our economy is built, everyone is so specialized that if the rest of the world were to disappear, we would just insta-die. We would not have a chance because we have only developed our skill and specialized in our skill so well, so efficiently, that we are so dependent on everybody else.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. Milton Friedman, he was an economist during the 80s, had this great example that kind of illustrates his point. He said, try to make a pencil by yourself. And you realize that just a simple tool that's so necessary for writing and stuff is impossible for one person to make. You need someone who makes the wood, someone who makes the lead, someone who makes the metal, someone who makes the erasers. All these different groups work together to supply those parts.
Right.
But try to do it yourself, and it's impossible.
Right, exactly. And it's more efficient to specialize in something and continuously do that one specialty than to be a jack of all trades who collects the wood, who collects the lead, who processes the wood and lead, makes the metal, gets the eraser.
Yeah, so to basically sum this up is the reason that we theorize to why we seek so much validation is because of evolutionary psychology and the importance of working in units and groups and the importance of not being ostracized from your group because of devastating consequences.
Yeah.
So it's built up these mechanisms that seek validation, some people more than others.
And one thing I wanted to mention about validation, from the 5 love languages, the author kind of talks about 5 different languages that help you relate or validate almost with the other person. So those 5 are physical touch, verbal affirmation, giving gifts, quality time, acts of service. So let me just go through them real quick rundown. Physical touch is obviously in a relationship, you physically a pat, pat on the shoulder, back rub, all these things. And a lot of people think, that's just totally guys. That's all guys are. But a lot of people actually really believe that for guys, it's verbal affirmation. So back to the compliments that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And one thing I wanted to talk about while we were on compliments is that to decipher between a fake compliment, flattery, versus a sincere compliment is how the person says it and what are their choice of words. So,
and also what's going on there is how they say it and their choice of words is entirely affected by the cognition in their head, what they're saying to themselves in their head.
Yeah.
So that kind of adds to what we're
saying. You go to the boss and say, your kids are just amazing. They're just so cute. What did you guys do this weekend? If you're just trying to make amazing or incredible or generic words, you're smart. That was just really cool, man. Those are just so generic that, anybody could say that.
Yeah.
But if you name a very specific example that illustrates that quality so well, then it becomes sincere. And the only way you could actually get that example is if it actually is sincere.
Right.
So I might say something like, Paul, the way you articulated evolutionary psychology was amazing. You gave specific examples that backed up your point. You can communicate very well. So that comes across more sincerely because it is sincere.
Yeah.
I'm giving a specific example. So for all you ladies out there, that's how you win the guys over.
That's a great point. And actually a lot of dating teachers talk about that is a compliment of a generic kind of compliment just suggests manipulation.
Right.
It just suggests that you want something from them. So, and because we possess this great ability to subconsciously pick up on body cues and stuff, people have a good ability to pick up on this stuff like that. And so when you do say something specific, that's when it really, like you're saying, that's when the person really feels validated from it.
Yeah. And to finish the rundown, the third one is gift giving. Not a lot of people actually don't identify with this. This is kind of a rare one, but you just feel validated when people give you things like, maybe a surprise just on a random day or something, like box full of chocolates.
It's why Christmas is so much fun to those who give presents.
Yeah, right. And the fourth one is quality time, and this happens to be like the most popular one, especially with women, and like secondary for guys. So quality time is spending emotional time. This is where seek first understand comes in, where you just emotionally relate with the person. And the thing is that honestly, I think this is actually like just in all things considered the most important one of them all.
Yeah,
because
for one, it's you have the most control over it. You can like dislike the person, you can hate them. Your cognition can say like, I don't like this person at all, but you can still give that time to them.
Right. And one thing I was going to say too is because you can have all the money in the world, you can have all the fame in the world, you can be the top and the brightest and have all the recognition in the world.
But this is what you want. Yeah.
But the thing is that you still only have 24 hours. Nothing you can do can extend or take that away.
Yeah.
And so if you are giving an hour a day to your wife or to your kids, that means something.
It's invaluable. Yeah.
It's invaluable. You can't simply get more of that. You can give $1 million to your kids if you're a billionaire, but how much worth is that actually? To them, it might be a lot, but to you, it's just a measly million. So I think the point is that this is why I think quality time is so valuable, especially to women who kind of understand this. So there's that. And then finally, acts of service. So, he goes out and cuts the lawn for me, or he does the dishes for me, or he kind of takes care of the kids, or he does this.
It seems very similar to time, giving time to someone, but it's giving time to someone without being with them.
Right.
That's the distinction.
Right. But I think the thing is that in order to get validated, people want to be understood. I want you to know me more. And if you like that, then I feel more validated.
Right. And like another point we should make on this is that you want someone to like you for the true who you are at the core. You don't want someone to like you for something superficial that may not be true about you.
Right.
So until that person seeks to understand who you are, why you are the way you are, and why the decisions you made are the decisions you made, and maybe they like you for something like superficial, like your looks or something like that, you don't feel validated from that because the looks are fleeting. These qualities are fleeting. You know that until they know that core of you, they won't get the whole picture and understand why you are the way you are.
Right. One quick comment I want to just make on seek first understand. This is like the anti-argument. This is how you avoid arguments. And I think a lot of times people come to other people and say, I have a problem, and you naturally want to be the hero and say, oh, I know the solution, I'm smart.
Right, yeah.
I want to be validated, and I want to show you how smart I am.
Yeah, and then the other person wants validation from being listened to.
Right. But the thing is that the person 99% of the time will actually arrive at the solution themselves, and they will get validation for themselves for how smart they are that they found the solution. Yeah. So even if you know the solution, sometimes it's best just to listen to them.
Because, and also people would rather you listen. Like a core idea behind this is that the things people are saying to you aren't that important. What's really important is what they are trying to like insinuate to you, not through verbal means, but as person to person. So your wife you get home from work, your wife complains about how like the dishes aren't clean, you're not making enough money and things like that. It's not that she really cares about those things. She just wants you to spend more time with her. And oftentimes our communication with people is not clear. One of the things that people who are very good communicators do is they very clearly express what they want to. But most of the time when we say something, like when I talk about stuff I like right now, it's not so much that I'm talking about it because, well, I do think it's really interesting. I like talking about it. But at the same time, I want you to think that I'm like a certain way.
Yeah.
And so what people say and what they're actually trying to tell you is very different. So like when someone comes to you seeking advice, and they tell you about all of their problems and stuff, what they're not really often seeking is advice. They're often just wanting someone to relate to and listen to them. And
they just
they need a voice
their thoughts. Yeah. Right.
And so that's another element of it. So another thing I wanted to get into about this whole thing and how our thoughts affect our life is how our thoughts affect happiness. Because happiness is really crucial. Aristotle said that the purpose of life is happiness. Now, I think that striving too much for happiness will lead you in the dust and you won't be happy and stuff. But there's definitely, you want to strive to become something, but you don't want to strive to make everything perfect, which a lot of people do. People think they'll be happy,
when
this happens.
But hold on, not to be devil's advocate, but we just said earlier, when I get the better job, when I'm the CEO, things will be better. And that helps you in that moment. Right? So you're saying, though, you can't always strive, you can't always rely on that because in the end that ends up killing you? Like, you end up never actually achieving happiness?
Yeah, well, I think that it's important to recognize that when we need to look at specifics here, it's okay to sometimes think about the future. A perfect example is the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He talks about his experiences in Auschwitz concentration camp and how, no matter how much these guards devastated him, it one day clicked to him that he would allow, his thoughts are what allowed them to devastate him. He didn't have to give them that ability to humiliate him.
Yeah.
He had the power to like let it not affect him and to live fine. And so he said the reason why he survived Auschwitz was because he thought about the meaning that could come from his experience. He thought about how when he got out of Auschwitz, he could write a book and move forward. And that motivated him to stay alive when other people died. He said those that died weren't the weakest. They were the ones who had no motivation or meaning to their life. And so there's times, like that's a perfect example of when thinking about the future is beneficial to both their survival and to who we become later on. So you're right, like you very much need to look at specifics, but what you have to look at instances where it's truly hurting you and not benefiting you.
Okay.
So back to the happiness thing. So what I think makes someone happy is a lot of their internal dialogue, what their brain habitually says. And like we discussed before, you develop these habits of thinking that are positive and negative and stuff. And a lot of it is to avoid pain or to produce pleasure. And so what I think makes a happy person is someone who has habitual thoughts that are beneficial to them. I think a major one is like gratitude. Someone who looks at all of this like technology we have and they say like, wow, like I'm very blessed to have this. A king 200 years ago couldn't even own what I own. And they appreciate things and they appreciate people and they tell themselves how much they like the people. This is all internal dialogue that is malleable. It can be changed. So that's where what we were talking about before, the idea of analyzing our thoughts and seeing how they affect our lives comes into like a pragmatic mean or whatever. Yeah. Sorry for that stutter there. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about happiness in general, because I think that the core to happiness is our thoughts. And like I said, thoughts are pretty inexplicable. We don't understand them very well. So I think one of the main reasons why meditation makes people feel so much better is because they start to observe these thought patterns and they start to change them. In general, happiness has very little to do with material, which is what a lot of people think, and success and fame. And I want to explain why. Material and success it will validate you for your efforts and stuff, but at the end of the day, your thoughts, once you have that material, your thoughts don't change that much. They don't become better. Like you don't think like if you think anything, you just think I'm better than these people because I have money, I'm better than this and that, and those thoughts aren't really that healthy, because then when you're in a social relationship with them, your body language, the way that you act, sort of throws that out at people.
You become more prideful because you think you're better than the other person because of X, Y, and Z. And
that's where our cognition can be devastating to our social relationships. And those, to me, are far more important. Like we talked about evolutionary, why those are more important. At the end of the day, right now, each one of us who's listening to this podcast probably has more wealth than anybody had like
300 years ago,
even 50, 60 years ago. Maybe that's pushing it, but so we all have a lot of material, but we aren't necessarily any happier than we used to be.
Right.
And I think a perfect example of this is illustrated in some studies they did on lottery winners and paraplegics. They did a study of lottery winners, and they found that after winning the lottery, the person was very happy for 30 days, about 30 days on average, and then after 30 days, they went back to the same level of happiness they had been prior to winning the lottery.
And it just seems so unbelievable. Like
I
still can't believe it.
It's hard to like say that to yourself, but that's what most people have. Maybe you won't be that person, but to most of the people in the study, that's what it was like.
And why is that?
The reason why is we get back to the habitual thoughts. When a drastic event happens, your thoughts different, like chemicals come in, and your thoughts are very different, and that's 30 days.
Now let me pose a devil's advocate to you. Yeah. You're saying, well, our habitual train of thinking
comes back.
And that limits then our happiness level. But let me just say this. If we were too happy and we were too content with everything, maybe that would lose our motivation to constantly improve our life. And if we didn't improve our life, that would be an evolutionary disadvantage. Uh-huh. So you may be conditioned not to be happy all the time because it actually increases your chances of survival to improve your life.
So the question here is how much is enough? Is too much? How much positivity, how much happiness is actually detrimental to your lifestyle? And I think that the question that's asked is, what is the human ideal? What is the ideal human? And who is it, and how do we strive to become that? Because there is a limit, like you're saying. There is a limit to how happy we can be. We live in a flawed world, and bad things always happen to people, whether they're good or bad. But like everybody lives in a world where people will die around them, and where everyone will age, where good things will leave. Things like that. So there's obviously a limit. So I think what my whole idea of self-development is that we need to find the people who are the ideal and become more like them. But we don't need to go beyond that.
Right. But I guess here's the thing. I've always wondered. We always think about how in evolution, where during those times, you just try to get as much as you could get, as much food as you could get, as many children as you could get, things like that, because that dramatically increased your chances of survival.
Right.
And so you had this never-ending greed, because honestly, it would only be good if you got more. But we're at a stage right now in our world where, it doesn't matter if you get more food because you already have a year's worth of supply.
Yeah.
I mean, you're fine.
Well, this is what you're actually highlighting is a flaw of evolutionary psychology.
Right.
You have to realize that evolutionary psychology is a very theoretical field. We can make up any historical scenario and make that the reason for equality that we currently have.
Yeah.
There are people alive right now who aren't materialistic at all. They don't seek to get more and more. There are people like Buddhist monks. Like, how materialistic do you think they are to spend 16 hours a day meditating? So we can't take necessarily evolutionary psychology to actually be real, because a lot of times we're just backtracking a characteristic of humans and then making an evolutionary story for it. And so I think that this idea that people, because for survival, need to keep getting more and more is just a story that a theoretical evolutionary psychologist came up with to explain why most people are greedy. But it doesn't explain that. You see the same thing with women, for example. Like, women should in general not sleep around with many guys, because they risk often, like, one father won't stay with them. They'll have children with multiple guys, and then they won't have a parent to raise the kid.
Right.
But then you have, in our world, you have many girls who seem to not follow that at all. They sleep around as much as they want, and they do it for fun and stuff. I'm not like passing any judgments on that, but this whole theory from evolutionary psychology seems to almost be like destroyed by real life examples that contradict it. So let's get back into the topic of like happiness and stuff and how our cognition affects it. Last psychology podcast, I talked about cognitive therapy and how you work to change these thoughts. But what I'm saying with my theory is that I think that most people are very unaware of their thoughts and how they actually affect their behavior. And so the first step, I think, into self-development and becoming that person that you want to become is first identifying what type of person you want to become. And I think most of us want to be happy people. So we need to study what makes people happy. Most researchers say that there's two things that make people happy. One is relationships, and other is our self-accomplishment, like completing goals, things like of that nature. So I think that any person that you're looking to become needs to embody these two characteristics. They need to be very social, not necessarily, like, we all need different amounts of social attention and stuff, but they need to be someone who, is somewhat validated, but validates other people. And then they need to be someone who's autonomous. And so you're going to have these habitual thoughts, and you have to go through and just observe them, how they affect your day. And you need to understand, like, we talked about multiple personalities. Which personality is it that you want to have in this situation? And then the way you make that a reality is you observe the way you think, the way you are in those situations, and then you work to embody that in the situation you want. And that takes a lot of practice. I think it's important to recognize things like being in the zone, sort of. Like, we get socially in the zone. And we get in the zone when we play basketball. Being in the zone is the idea that most of our brain is used up for that activity. We're so in the moment that we're not wasting energy on thinking about stuff. We're just doing.
Right.
And it happens socially too. And so a lot of times people want to recreate that being in the zone sort of thing socially with their friends, because every joke they're saying hits and things like that. So by dissecting our thoughts and understanding why we think what we do, how what we're thinking actually affects reality, we can begin to reshape our behavior into becoming that more ideal person. And to me, that's why self-development is important. You don't become the ideal person because you'll acquire fame or wealth necessarily. You become that ideal person because you feel better that way. No one wants to be a loser in a social situation.
Right.
No, everyone wants to be like a fun person that people like. And we've talked about, validation of other people is important. Seek first to understand before being understood. We've talked about how our thoughts affect social interactions and happiness.
The five love
languages. And so I think that, everyone who's listening should spend time thinking about who they want to be, and then they need to dissect their thoughts. And so few people are aware of their thoughts or aware of how they affect their life. But if you start dissecting them and understanding them, you can become a much happier person. And I know this because I've done it to myself.
All right, that's all the time that we have today, folks. Thanks for listening in. We'll be sure to give you some more material next episode. Thanks.